wonderful truth here that I do not want us to miss. Let's read together verses 1 through 5, and then we'll have a short word of prayer and then go through this passage. Moreover, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Go and cry in the ears of Jerusalem, saying, Thus saith the Lord, I remember thee, the kindness of thy youth, the love of thine espousals, when thou wentest after me in the wilderness in a land that was not sown. Israel was holiness unto the Lord, and the first fruits of his increase. All that devour and shall offend, evil shall come upon them, saith the Lord. Hear ye the word of the Lord, O house of Jacob, and all the families of the house of Israel. Thus saith the Lord. What iniquity have your fathers found in me, that they are gone far from me, and have walked after vanity, and are become vain? Let's pray together. Our God and Father, we thank you for your word. I pray that you might make the application to each heart today. I prayed earlier today that you would bring each person that came to church this morning, that you would match the hearts with the passage of your word. And so I trust you for that and pray that you would do a work of grace in each one's heart today. In Jesus' name, amen. I read a true account of a man and his wife who had been married for about 10 years. He thought their marriage was solid until one day his wife of 10 years told him that she did not love him anymore. Picture yourself in that man's place. Engage your imagination. The one you love and who you thought loved you has just told you that they do not love you anymore. And then they leave. Picture yourself looking through a photo album of maybe your wedding or your honeymoon or the early years of your life together and reflecting on the memories of those first few years when things were good, when you thought your love was solid. Your expectations at that point in life were high for the future. Things were good. And then, 10 years in, she tells you she does not love you anymore. Lots of questions would come into your mind about what caused all this. What did I do wrong? And you ask yourself what happened, and you think about it constantly. And you don't have any answers. Where did our love go? If you can get a sense of that feeling associated with that, if you can get your mind wrapped around that and place yourself in that scenario, you will get a sense of this passage of Scripture here in Jeremiah chapter 2. God is asking his people through Jeremiah, where did our love go? And the image is one of the heartbreak of a severed relationship. Now, as I said, this is a large, long passage of Scripture, and so we're going to move through it very quickly. And I hope you have your Bibles, because it'll be easier for you to stay focused and attentive to the message if you do. But in these first few verses, what God is doing here is reflecting on a better time. And he says to them, I remember you, verse 1 of chapter 2. He tells Jeremiah, go say this to the people, I remember you in the kindness of thy youth. It was a relationship typified by kindness. Very considerate, especially in early years of marriage. Most people are very considerate of one another's feelings and their desires and, about pleasing that other person. It's typified by kindness and characterized by expressions of commitment. Note again in verse 2. I remember thy kindness of thy youth the love of thine espouses. Did you catch that? The love. Expressions of love and commitment, sweet nothings and assurances and displays of love. That's typical of marriages, especially in the early years. But it was not just a tender bond, it was a relationship that was typified by faith. He says, when thou wentest after me in the wilderness in a land that was not sown. During the time when we were going through a land, he's talking about the wilderness wanderings, I think, here. And how they followed him, how they trusted him. He's talking about them following him in a land that was not planted and was barren of crops. It's a very arid, that area of the world is very arid, it's very desert-like. There's plant life there, but it's really not, it's not farmland. We live in a rural community where you travel around here and you see crops planted everywhere, you see green everywhere. It is lush with soybeans and corn or wheat or whatever has been planted there. That land that he's talking about is not like this. God says, still you followed me. There was a commitment and a trust that they followed him, and it was exemplified by trust. Some years ago, we were hiking in a huge state park with some friends. Actually, they were friends of our children. They knew them quite well. I'd gone to college with them, and they'd grown up in this area. And we were at this huge, huge state park, big forested area, lots of trails. And this guy that was leading us through this area, he says, I've been here like all my life. He'd grown up there. He'd been born in that area, gone through these trails. And he said, I know my way around here. And he led us on this hike. And we hiked and had a great time and traveled through that area. And we followed him. We trusted him. And he got us lost for hours and hours. We could not get a signal on our cell phones. It was that's how remote this place was. And it's an understatement to say that my wife and I were disappointed in him. I was mad. I mean, I was livid. The children of Israel followed God. It wasn't perfect. You know it wasn't perfect, but for 40 years they followed him in the wilderness and traveled in the wilderness and were committed and trusted him. And that's what God refers to here. And they had a relationship of mutual concern. In verse 3, Israel was holiness unto the Lord, and the first fruits of his increase. Now, don't miss the significance of that, because he is saying they were the first fruits. Holiness, and let me back up just a bit. Holiness is separation. That's the word. That means it's set apart. And when he says Israel was holiness unto the Lord and the first fruits of his increase, the first fruits of any harvest were uniquely God's. They were separated as dedicated to him. And so he's describing his people as uniquely separated unto him. It was his. It was protected by his divine care. Israel was separated unto the Lord. That's the meaning. And by virtue of that was protected by divine care. All that devour him, the first fruits, if you take the first fruits and devour this, you are committing an offense. That is what he's saying here in this passage. All that devour him shall offend, evil shall come upon them, saith the Lord. You do that, you take what belongs to God, and you take it for yourself, you're going to pay. There was this mutual concern. And again, it's very, very similar. Very similar to a relationship. I mean, most of you guys could probably testify that somebody could insult you and they could mock you or call you names or whatever, and you could probably take that. But if they do that to your wife, yeah, that's exactly. it is one thing if you insult me and attack me. It's quite another if you do that to my wife. And what God is saying here is that Israel was wholly separated unto him. First fruits, and anyone that devours the first fruits that belong to me, they're going to pay. So this is that relationship. It's a tender bond, typified by trust, exemplified by mutual concern. But things change. In verse 4, he says, "Hear ye the word of the Lord, O ye house of Jacob, and all the families of the house of Israel." This is directed to everybody. And it's a question. He asked the question, it's a question of culpability. "Hear the word of the Lord, all ye families of the house of Israel. Thus saith the Lord, what iniquity have your fathers found in me, that you are gone far from me, and have walked after vanity, and have become vain?" This is a question about guilt. What did I do? What's wrong with me? God says to them, that you turned away from me. It's an inquiry as to the reason for them abandoning him. How have I disappointed you? What did I do? God says. What was wrong with me? And let me remind you that when God asks questions in his word, it's not because he lacks information. It's not because he's investigating, trying to find out trying to find out something he doesn't know. Anytime God asks questions in his word, and this is kind of a good hermeneutic for you, as you work through the word of God, you'll see a lot of questions asked by God. Those are not designed for him to get information. They are designed for analysis. They are diagnostic questions. They're designed to make us think. What iniquity did you find in me that made you leave me? Now this is important because God did not leave them. They left him. They dumped him. God's people were the ones who walked out. They used to love him, but it's all over now. And that's worth considering, as someone said, whenever God seems distant. As the saying goes, one commentator said, if God does not seem as close as he used to, who moved? So this is a question of culpability. It's also a question of desirability. Now notice he says, what did you see in me that was so bad that you left and followed after vanity? Now note this. It's not just that they left, but it's what they left for. So he says, you followed after vanity and are become vain. There are two concepts here. Number one, they walked after vanity. There have been some instances when someone has left a husband or a wife or some really crummy person. I mean, that's the best way I can put it. And sometimes when you hear people talk about it, you can tell by the pronouns used. For instance, you left your wife for her? That's what I mean about the emphasis on the pronoun. She left him for him? It's the pronoun. It's the, as someone said, the emphasis on the right syllable. It's the emphasis. And sometimes people will ask, you left your husband or your wife for that? It's not even a personal pronoun. I knew of a wife who left a decent guy for some doofus she met online. And when that happens, people throw up their hands and say, what? And God is asking his people, What is it about me that you left me for that? But there's something more in the verse here. In verse 5. Not only had they walked after vanity, they had become vain. They had become vain. Now, I want us to keep in mind the biblical usage of the word vain. Because when we use the term vain in 2020, you know how we mean it? We mean it as, if we describe someone as vain, we mean it as somebody who's stuck on themselves, who looks in the mirror and has trouble walking away because they just like what they see. They're stuck on themselves. That is not really the Old English word translated vain here in our traditional Bibles. The word vain here means empty. It means worthless. It means transitory. It means unsatisfactory. It means shallow. All of those kinds of concepts mixed together. That's the idea. Worthless. You ever hear someone described as not worth the powder it takes to blow him up? That's vain. That's what we're talking about. So God is asking his people, what is it about me that you follow that? But then he says, you've not only followed that, you've become that. Verse 5. And are become vain. It was not simply what they did that was at issue here. It is what they had turned into in the process of that. Is what they've become. They had rejected God for that which was shallow and empty, and in the process, they themselves had become shallow and empty. I heard someone say when I was young, it's been so long ago I can't remember who or even when the first time was. But they said this, be careful who you run with. Who you run with, you will begin to like. And whom you begin to like, you will begin to be like. I thought that was an interesting thing to say. How many times has someone started hanging out with a group of friends, or maybe even just one person? If a relationship starts, and their friends and their family start to whisper, I don't even know them anymore. Did you ever hear someone say that? I don't even know this person anymore. This person that I was close to and I had intimate contact with and I thought I knew very well. Now, I don't even know. God is saying to his people, you have left me for that. And you've also become that. What a thing. So, here are questions. God is saying, what have I done? And there's a question of desirability. You've left me to follow that. Why would you do that? And then as we move through the passage, and we're going to have to go very quickly here, it becomes a question of appreciation. Neither said they, where's the Lord that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, that led us through the wilderness, through a land of deserts and of pits, through a land of drought and of the shadow of death, through a land that no man passed through, and where no man dwelt. Now, this is not an accusation. It is a recognition of what God had brought them through. Did you ever go to a place with somebody and you lost track of them and you said, where did they go? You know, and maybe they wandered over here. But you soon recognize, because of the relationship, hey, this person's not here in proximity to me. I've got to find them. And God is saying, you didn't ask that question. I brought you through the land of deserts and pits and land of drought and so on. And verse 7, and I brought you into a plentiful country to eat the fruit thereof and the goodness thereof. But when you entered, You defiled my land and made my heritage an abomination. You never asked the question, where is the Lord who took us out of that and brought us into this wonderful place? In other words, they forgot their blessings. They didn't appreciate God anymore, what he had done for them. They didn't appreciate him for what he had delivered them from and what he had given them and what he had brought them to. They forgot. And at some point, they had stopped reflecting on God's blessings to them as a people. Someone said this. He said, remember what God has done in your life. The road to spiritual adultery begins when you stop reveling in the love of God. Few Christians plan to fall into grievous sin. It is only after falling that they realize they have drifted away from the God of love. So, you have this reflections on a better time in the first part of the chapter, and then you have these inquiries into the present heartache that that he was experiencing. They weren't, he was. And then God begins to make his case, and he ceases to ask questions, or he ends asking questions at this point and starts making assertions. But when you entered, verse 7, but when you entered my land, you defiled my land and made mine heritage an abomination. This is what you did. You corrupted the land that I brought you into, this wonderful place. Some of you may have had rental property. I don't know if you've ever experienced this. Or maybe you've personally known people who had rented their property to someone. And maybe these were people they were trying to help. Maybe they gave them a cut on the rent or something. These were people they were trying to help. And those people moved into their property and absolutely trashed it. I see enough heads nodding that I know that's such a familiar thing. It's happened many, many times. Somebody moves into this, and the property's really nice, the house is nice, and they live there for a while, and they absolutely destroy it or trash it. Israel had done that. They moved into this pristine place, and God says, you've corrupted it. They had mixed in Baal worship and the debauchery of Baal worship into the land, and they had transformed this land into something corrupt. So they corrupted the land, but they corrupted themselves. And beginning in verse 8, God talks about the corruption that started among the people. So in verse 8, the priests said not, where is the Lord? Verse 6 says, the people didn't say, where is the Lord? But the priests weren't saying that. The priests said not, where's the Lord? And they that handle the law knew me not. So he said there was apathy among the priests. They didn't care. They didn't care about God. They weren't seeking the Lord. They were indifferent to God. They weren't even asking themselves the question, where is God? You know, sometimes people ask themselves in times of despair, where is God? Even the Psalms ask that question. But the priests weren't even asking that question. It came to a point where they had religion without God. I was reading an article from the New York Times of the growing popularity of religion without God. And there have been something like 200 assemblies that they are calling Sunday assemblies. But these are for people who want to go to church because they enjoy a sense of ritual and quietness, but they want it to be God neutral. Well, that was the faith among these priests. They were so involved in the rituals and the functions of religion that God really didn't matter all that much. And if it's like that among the priests, then it's going to be bad among the people. You can pretty much bank on that. They were not even asking the question, where is God? There was a disconnect. They that handle the word of the Lord knew me not. The word of the law. So there was apathy among the priests, and there was antipathy by the leadership. Notice what it says here: the pastors also transgressed against me. There was, when it's referring to the pastors, keep in mind, Israel was not a church. Israel was a national entity that was a theocracy. And so when he was referring to the pastors here, that word pastors is literally shepherds. And what he's talking about here is not pastors in the sense that I'm a pastor or someone else is a pastor. It's pastor in the sense of a leader. And what he's talking about is the national leaders, the king, the governors. Decrees that sanctioned what God did not sanction. Similar things are happening here in the U.S. In our country, you have the leadership deliberately passing laws and ruling on things that are antithetical to what God expresses. This was the leadership of Israel. So there's apathy among the priests, antipathy among the leadership, and apostasy by the prophets. Notice what he says here: and the prophets prophesied by Baal, and walk after things that do not profit. That word, that expression, things that are worthless. Back to that concept of vain. So, the prophet's business was to press the moral and spiritual truths of the law home to the hearts of the people, as one commentator said, but they drew their inspiration from Baal. And what they had really done is synthesized Jehovah worship and Baal worship and made it kind of a blend. And that's why he says here, they prophesied by Baal. So, here's the situation. And by the way, Baal is not just one god. Baal is many gods. Look down at verse 28 of chapter 2. We're not really going to cover this verse, but I just want you to see what God says here. Verse 28, but where are thy gods that thou hast made thee? Let them arise, if they can save thee in the time of thy trouble. For according to the number of thy cities are thy gods. So, however many towns and villages were in Israel at that time, that's how many gods they had. And they were all called Baal. The word is in the plural, Baalim. Baalim. So, the apostates, or the prophets were apostates. That's how things had disintegrated. So, in verse 9, God indicts them. Wherefore I will yet plead with you, saith the Lord, and with your children's children will I plead. Plead, there is a legal term. It is a term that was used in the King James English for an accusation or an indictment. If somebody was impleaded, you'll see that word sometimes in the King James. It's Old English. If someone's impleaded, they are being sued at the law. That's the idea. To plead in the 2020 sense is begging. That's not what God's doing here. God is asserting. And this is a call to analysis. Wherefore I will plead with you, saith the Lord, and with your children's children will I plead. And it is a call to analysis here. Now, don't get lost here in this narrative, because it is in these verses that sometimes our minds start wandering because we can't make any connection with what the places that are being talked about. So stay with me here. Verse 10, for pass over the isles of Chittim, and see, and send unto Kedar, and consider diligently, and see if there be such a thing. Hath a nation changed their gods, which are yet no gods? But my people have changed their glory for that which does not profit. So, stay with me. This is a call for them to think. The Isles of Chittim refers to the island of Cyprus and little islands around it. It was called Chittim at that time. Lakes and seas and places changed names over time. And so here you are in Israel.
And to the west, in the Mediterranean Sea, way out to sea, there is the island of Cyprus, and there's a bunch of little islands around there. And people travel around by boats because it's an island. And so God is talking to his people. He says, now think about those islands to the west of you. I think I'm pointing north right now. Stay with me. Use your imagination. The islands to the west. And then think about the people of Kedar, he says in verse 10. That's to the east. And those are Bedouin, Arabic peoples that live out in the desert and travel around on camels and live in tents. There could not be two opposite kinds of people, cultures, that he could have drawn the comparison to. He said, those people live out in the islands and they travel around on boats and they fish and they travel and they take goods to places. And those people that live out in the desert, they live in tents and travel around on camels. They don't betray their gods. Go there and look at them. Hath a nation changed their gods? And they aren't gods. This is verse 11. Which are yet no gods. But my people have changed their glory for that which is vain, empty. Who does this? Who does what you do, is what God is saying. The heathen don't even do that. Now, this is not the only time in Scripture where God refers to the lost and uses them as an example. We see this at least a couple more times in Scripture. The parable of the unjust steward in the Gospels, where Jesus tells a story about this steward, and it says in verse 8, and the Lord commended the unjust steward because he had done wisely. And then Jesus says, for the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. What he's saying here is that lost people have more sense than believers do sometimes. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, I'm just giving you an example here, the Apostle Paul, under the inspiration of the Spirit of God, says that it's reported commonly that there's fornication among you, and such fornication as is not so much as named among the Gentiles. Paul's saying, lost people don't even do this. What you are doing. And what God is saying here through Jeremiah is pointing out that even totally different heathen nations have more of a consistent allegiance to their gods than does Israel. That's what he's pointing out here. And those gods are not gods at all. So, moving through the passage here, wrapping things up. He said this is a call to analysis, but it's also a call to astonishment. Verse 12, be astonished, O you heavens, at this, and be horribly afraid. Be very desolate, saith the Lord. This situation calls for just being floored, being astonished, being perplexed. This is bewildering. Look at verse 13. For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain, which is an artesian well that just bubbles up water with an endless supply. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed them out cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. This is astounding. An incredible thing to do, a self-destructive thing to do. To turn away from a source of water that bubbles up and create your own containers, but these containers are cracked and can't hold water. That's what you've turned to. And the analogy is pretty vivid. Water, we underestimate. We have such an abundance of water here that that we just, turn on a faucet and there it is, and we don't think twice about it. But in an arid country where water is scarce, it is a source of life. He said, this is incredible that you would do this. I'll never forget a young couple with young kids in our first ministry. They weren't members of our church, but they had visited and were coming on a semi-regular basis. And they just looked like a wholesome family. They just looked healthy in the way they were trying to raise their family and their relationship. And they were professed Christians. The Lord knows their hearts, but they began to drift. And mom and dad, I don't know if they got involved with other people, but they began to party anyway. And I lost contact with them for some years. And some years later, the wife showed up by herself in church. No family with her, no husband with her. They were divorced, I found out, and she looked absolutely a wreck. She had lived the dream, and it became a nightmare. What have you done? God says to his people, you have forsaken me. You've forsaken me to hew out cisterns that can't hold water. Now, in the next few verses, he's calling them to consideration, and what he's talking about here, beginning in verse 14, is Israel. Remember we said that Judah was only the one left, that Israel had already been conquered, the 10 northern tribes. And he says to consider them. This is a call to consideration. And he says, Israel, he's referring to the 10 northern tribes, is he a homeborn slave? Why is he spoiled? Spoiled means conquered, looted. Why? The young lions roared upon him and yelled, and they made his land waste. He's talking about Assyria. Came in and wasted Israel. His cities are burned without inhabitant. They're ghost towns now. So they were conquered by Syria. And then he says, and the children of Noph and Tahpanhes have broken the crown of their head. These are two cities in Egypt, Noph and Tahpanhes. So he said, they've broken the crown of your head. He's talking about Israel here, in the north. This is what's happened to them. Hast thou not, verse 17, procured this unto yourself, in that thou hast forsaken the Lord thy God when he led thee by the way? And haven't you done this to yourself, is what he's saying. So, in the next few verses, he is telling them to own this. Own it. Haven't you done this? Hast thou not procured this unto thyself? One writer said concerning this passage, he said, wickedness contains its own chastening. God says to them, and now what hast thou to do in the way of Egypt, to drink the waters of Sihor? Or what hast thou to do in the way of Syria, to drink the waters of that river? He says, you're doing the same thing. Thine own wickedness, verse 19, thine own wickedness shall correct thee, and thy backsliding shall reprove thee. Know therefore and see that it's an evil thing and bitter that thou hast forsaken the Lord thy God, and that my fear is not in thee, saith the Lord of hosts. What he's saying is that you've done this to yourself. You have made the choices that have come back to haunt you. And you're going to pay the consequences for doing what your brethren in the north did, and now it's happening to you. You are doing this to yourself. And you need to own this. Thine own wickedness shall correct thee. Now what he's telling them to do is to own the egregiousness of their sin. Notice in verse 19, know therefore and see that it's an evil thing and bitter that thou hast forsaken the Lord thy God, and that my fear is not in thee, saith the Lord God of hosts. They needed to see their sin in its hideousness. They didn't see the egregiousness of it, the extraordinary wickedness of it. They refused to see that. And Jeremiah, under the inspiration of the Spirit of God, as he's preaching to them, is telling them, why don't you see how really bad this is and that you've done this to yourself? How can you not see that? Well, let me tell you something. It is easy. I was reading through headlines. And it's a consistent headline that is seen in that a criminal showed little remorse for the crime that he did. Let me just read these. July 10th, 2016. Quote, a man who admitted killing his parents and setting their home on fire showed little remorse when he confessed his crimes to police last year. Here's another one. After hit and run, suspect shows little remorse. Here's another one. Deer Lodge man shows little remorse in alleged homicide. Another quote. Man who killed Ottawa sportscaster Brian Smith shows little remorse in interview. What's the common theme in all those headlines? Little remorse. They're not owning the egregiousness of the sin. And what God is saying to these folks, you have turned away from me and you don't see how terrible this really is and how foolish and destructive. This is what you've done. And you've not owned it. Verse 21, yet I have planted thee a noble vine, wholly a right seed, and how art thou turned into a degenerate plant of a strange vine unto me? I planted you a wonderful flower, and you turned into a weed. And you can't hide it, for though thou wash thee with Snyder was a cleansing agent, and take thee much soap, yet thine iniquity is marked before me, saith the Lord God. You can't get away from it. You can't hide it. You need to own what you've become. In verse 23, how canst thou say, I'm not polluted? I have not gone after Balaam. See the way in the valley. Know what thou hast done. Thou art a swift dromedary, traversing her ways. Now that's a camel. He's saying you're like a riderless camel that's just wandering. Now let me just give you really quickly the comparisons he makes. And I encourage you to read it on your own. But he says in verse 20, for of old time I have broken thy yoke and burst thy bands, and thou saidst, I will not transgress, when upon every high hill and under every green tree that thou wanderest, playing the harlot. He said, you've been like a woman who pledges faithfulness and acts like a prostitute. In verse 21, again, a wholesome plant that changed into a weed. Verse 23, like a riderless camel wandering aimlessly, crisscrossing her paths, a swift dromedary traversing her ways, like a wild donkey in heat. Verse 24, a wild ass used to the wilderness that snuffeth up the wind at her pleasure, in her occasion who can turn her away? All that seek her will not weary themselves, in her month they shall find her. Apparently the habits of a female donkey, a wild donkey, are pretty dramatic and vulgar. She sniffs the urine of a male and then puts her nose in the air and goes wandering after him. That's the analogy that he's making here with Israel. And then finally he says, as a thief that is finally caught, verse 26, as the thief is ashamed when he's found, so the house of Israel is ashamed. Nothing to show for a life of crime. All he has is the shame of a misspent life. And God says, all these things are you. This is what you've become. And he says, own this. You know, invariably, there is no hope for someone who won't admit where they're at. You know, alcoholics, drug addicts, until they admit what they have become, there's no hope. We don't like to look in the mirror and see ugly there. In the book of Revelation, there's a church there that he addresses called the Church of Ephesus, and he says to them, you've done a lot of good stuff, but I have somewhat against you because you have left thy first love. Remember from from where you've fallen and repent and do the first works, or judgment's coming. God's people, when they refuse to look at where they are, when they refuse to take responsibility, when they make excuses. Well, I wouldn't be the way I am except my mother never showed me love. Or I wasn't popular in school. My friends just treated me. My boss is unfair. I wouldn't have done what I've done unless, and you know what? It's excuse making. And God's people were excellent at that. There's no hope unless you own it. Maybe that's you today. I don't know. Maybe God could ask you, what did I do to deserve you dumping me? What was so worth pursuing that was so much better than I am?